Hello and welcome to Skills and Automation. My name is Ash and today we'll be constructing a reporting macro where the user has the ability to control various elements of the macro flow. There is a lot of variety of code out here with a huge emphasis on error handling, which is something I don't do in my regular videos. Before we get into the demo though, I do want to mention that the idea for this project is based on a comment from a viewer of this channel. So basically, we need to configure a macro file where we get the values for the whole automation from the worksheet based on user input rather than hard coding these values into the code. Now, I really appreciate this request because it's bang in the middle of the style of macros I like building. So let's move on to the demo. This is the control sheet. The fields in pink or rather peach is where the user can type in or select certain things. So the underlying flow is rather straightforward. It has 3 distinct steps, which you can see here as well. Step 1, we will copy the data from a file that is located in the input folder path defined by the user here in column I, and we will paste the data into the data sheet. Step 2, we will apply some transformation to the data, transfer it into a new workbook, and save the file in the output folder path, again, which is defined by the user out here. And in step 3, we will email out that file to the email addresses defined in column K, and we will pick up the subject and body from these cell values here. And these are the options that the user can choose. We can run the full macro or rather all 3 steps in one go, or we can run each step individually. And that choice is managed by these radio buttons, which allows us to select only one option. One use case for giving this level of exposure to the user is that sometimes the user may first want to simply create the initial report and manually inspect it before sending it out. But let me give you a more selfish reason for providing this functionality. Sometimes a user may come to you and say that some field is being transformed incorrectly, and 99% of the time is because the source data is incorrect. So by exposing these 3 layers, the user can themselves inspect the data as it's being transformed and figure out the data issue for themselves instead of coming to you. And I'm not being cynical. In my experience within an office environment, people like to troubleshoot themselves instead of having to reach out for help all the time. Moving on, we have 2 more radio buttons for previewing the email. This option lets you decide whether you want to send out the email directly or just create the email and display it so that you can visually check if everything looks okay before hitting the send button. This is especially handy if you have upper level managers in your email list out here and you want to double check everything before publishing the information. And finally, we have the macro button itself. This will execute the code based on the selections that we have given out here. Okay, let's run this once. We will choose the full run option and we will preview our email, hit run. And our email has been generated with the file attached, and our send to, subject, and email body have been populated as well. Great. One more thing I would like to add is that all the cells except the one in peach are locked. We can't edit them. All these input cell references are hard-coded into our code, so we don't want the user to accidentally delete any rows or move any cells around. Okay. So this was the top layer of what we are building today. But this is not where the beauty of the project is. All the complexity is bundled up in our error handling procedures. So here's the issue. With the user now in control of the input and output parameters, we need to validate every parameter to avoid the code essentially breaking down on us. And that's what this macro is doing in the background. So let's feed in an incorrect file path. And we will try to import the file, hit the run button. We get a message saying that at least one error was found, click OK. And we're directed to the error page where a more specific error has been given to us, saying that the input folder not found, which is correct. Let's force another failure. We will remove the @ symbol from one of the emails and let's try to send the email. Hit run. Again, an error has been picked up. And we are told that at least one email ID is incorrect. There are a lot more checks that we will see as we begin coding, but for a final part, I want to show you the admin page. All our custom error codes are fed in out here, and when there is a failure, our validation logic picks up the error code from this sheet and gives the user back the description from column B. And we have implemented a certain error design pattern that allows for this logic, which is what we will learn in our video today. Okay, so this video is divided in two parts. In part 1, we will build this Excel console sheet template and build out the code to perform all the logic based on the values in the console sheet. And in part 2, we will add the error handling to factor in any user-related errors while mistyping values in this console sheet. So let's start with building the template. In this section, we're going to construct the console sheet template. So I've already added some headers, field values, colored some columns, and resized some columns. But besides this sheet is just an empty template. There are no locked cells or hidden formulas. The data sheet is blank. There are 2 lookup tables. The error sheet is blank. And there are some error codes in the admin sheet. However, we'll delete these before we start coding. Let's go back to the console sheet. The main thing I want to show you out here is how we construct the radio buttons that we saw in the demo. And we are also going to lock these sheets, but leave the input cells unlocked. First, let's add a button for the macro. We'll come to our developer tab, insert, choose button from form controls. Create a nice big button. As I said, this is an empty workbook. There are no macros out here. So at the moment, we're not going to link this button to any macro. Let's just click OK and change the text. And by the way, I'll upload this blank template to GitHub as well, just in case you want to follow along. Okay, so let's add the radio buttons. So this action set has 4 options, and our objective is to let the user select only one option from these 4 and only one option from the preview email values. And the best way to force the user to select only one option is to use a radio option button. So we'll come back to our developer tab, insert, click on the option button, and we'll add the button here to cell E3. There is some default text out here. I'm just going to delete it off. Just adjust it to sit inside the cell. Okay, since this is the first radio button, it will carry the value 1 when we select it, but we want the value displayed in cell E2. And we'll code a macro to judge which option has been selected based on the value in cell E2. So what we'll do is right click on the radio button, go to format control. In control, we'll link the option button to cell E2, click OK. And once that's done, we'll just click on the actual cell E3 and drag it all the way down to E6. So we create 3 more copies of the radio button and all of them are linked to cell E2. Now we need to group these buttons together, and I'll explain why just a bit later on. But for now, let's come back to insert, and under form controls, let's select group box, and we'll wrap our option buttons inside this group box. And the group box comes with some default text as well. Let's delete it off. Okay. So let's select the full run option and select E2, and you can see the option 1 being displayed. Let's select the export file option. This is the third option, so we expect the value 3 to be displayed and 4. Okay, let's do the same thing for the preview email values. Come to insert, radio button. We'll link this button to cell E8. Drag it down and put the buttons inside another group box. So let's select yes. Click on cell E8, we can see the value 1 displayed, select no, and we can see the value 2 displayed. So we'll code a macro to read the value from cell E8, and accordingly we'll know whether we want to preview the email or send the email directly. And you might be wondering why we added the group box. Well, that is to separate the action radio buttons from the preview email buttons. What this means is, because of the group box, we can only select one option inside the preview email group, and we can select only one option inside the action group. If we didn't add a group box, then we would only be able to select one option from these 6 radio buttons, and that's not what we want. Okay, now we're going to lock the worksheet, but we will leave these input cells as editable. So what we're going to do is select each of our input cells, which are colored in, I think this looks like peach, so I'm going to call it peach from now on. So we will select all the peach cells, and since we're displaying the values in cell E2 and E8, we want to select those 2 as well. And we'll right click on them, go to format cells, go to protection, and we will deselect locked. So we don't want to see any check mark against locked. Okay, that's done. Now let's come down to our worksheet tab, right click on it. We'll go to protect sheet, and I'm just going to lock this sheet, give it a password. Okay, type the password again, click OK, and that's done. So if we click anywhere in the worksheet now, we get a warning, but the cells in peach are editable. We can add in some values, and we can still use our radio buttons, and we can click on a macro button as well. Well, there's no macro yet, so it's giving an error, but basically we can still click on it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and fill in the folder paths, the subject and emails, and we'll return in the next section and begin building the code. All right. Okay, so I filled in the input, output, and the email related details. Now that we have built our front-end template, it's time to build out the logic in the back end. We will start with building out the logic to sync our macro with the radio option chosen. Determining what option has been selected is straightforward. As I explained in the previous section, for the action group, the option selected at any time is given by the number in cell E2 in the console sheet. And just a note out here, since we had left the cell E2 unlocked, it is possible for the user to accidentally delete the value. So I'll just delete, which means that the value in the cell is blank and no option is selected. We will have to factor this scenario within our code as well. Okay, let's go to the VB editor, Alt F11. We are going to refer to our worksheets using the worksheet code names. Let's create a new module. Let's give our module a name, and let's create a new macro. So this will be our parent macro. We will call our various child macros from here. Our objective for the parent macro is to determine which toggle option has been selected and direct the macro flow to the correct child macro. So first, let's stop the screen from fluttering and stop Excel alerts from popping up. We will write this code in a separate sub and call it from this parent sub. So we'll create a new module. I'm going to call this module supporting logic. Please pay close attention to this module because we will be referring to it throughout this video. We'll be adding a lot of subs in this module. So let's create one sub to deactivate the Excel options. Let's create another sub to turn these back on. Okay, let's call these subs from our parent macro, deactivate and activate. Make some space. Okay, first let's grab the radio action option from cell E2. There is a possibility that the cell value is blank. If that happens, we will exit the sub. So if this variable is blank, we will go to a line label called terminate sub, and let's create the line label at the very bottom. So if the action is blank, the code will jump to the line label, which is down here. It will turn our alerts back on and exit the sub. Now we will separate out the logic for each steps, that is import, export and send email. But the full macro run or the first option will run each of those steps. So let's go to the logic for the import step first, which means if the import file or the full run is selected, there is options 1 and 2. Let's declare some variables for the input folder path, input file name, and the full path, which will be a concat of the file name and the folder path. So if the action is 1 or 2, then let's grab the folder path from cell I3, which is here. Similarly, we'll grab the input file name from cell E4. And let's create the full folder path, which is a concat of the folder path and the file name. And I'm just putting a reference for me to make sure I remove this logic later on, because we are going to concat the folder in a very different way. We will perform the actual import action in the next section of this video. For now, let's just put a message saying import data. In fact, let's put a message box when the action value is blank as well. Now we need this input full file path just for the import procedure. On the other hand, we need this full output file path for both the export and the send email procedure. For the export step, we need to know the full name of the file that we will be exporting to our folder drive. And for the send email step, we need to know the location of the file that we will be attaching to the email. So if the action selected is full run, export, or send email, then we'll create the full output file path. Back to our code, make some space here. Let's declare some variables. In fact, we can just copy and replace input with output. Make sure you select selected text and replace all. And let's write out the if condition. So if the action selected is 1, 3, or 4, then we'll grab the output file name, folder, and create the full file path. And once again, I'm just going to copy all this logic, paste it below, and replace input with output. And make sure you update the cell values that we are referencing. This should be export data. Now that we have the output file path, let's run the export logic only. So if the action selected is 1 or 3, actually I'll cut this and place a message out here saying that we are exporting the data. And just FYI, these message boxes are just placeholders. We'll be deleting these later on. And now let's code the email only logic, which is basically option 1 and 4. We'll change the message box. But in this case, we also need to grab the values of the preview email option chosen, the subject, the body, and the email addresses. The email addresses are a list in each cell. So what we're going to do is grab these emails in a dynamic array. Go back to our code. Let's declare some variables. And these email addresses will be stored inside an array. Let's grab the preview option value. Next, we'll grab the list of email IDs, but for that, we need to grab the last row. Actually, we need a last row variable declared as well. Okay, so the email IDs are in column K, and to find the last row, we will use the control up method. So we go to the bottommost cell in column K and then do an int XL up and grab the row number. Okay, and the array will go from cells K3 to the last row. We need the email subject and the email body. Okay, that's done. Well, almost. My approach when coding VBA is to make the code as readable as possible so that 6 months down the line, if I have to revisit the code, I can understand what's going on without much context. In that spirit, I am not happy about placing numbers against these action values. These numbers are a direct representation of the cell value in the console sheet, which in turn represents the macro action that has been chosen. However, I can't tell what 1 or 3 or 4 is just by looking at the code. I would have to constantly refer back to the worksheet. To make life easier, we can assign text to these numbers, which will make them more readable. And we can do this using enums or enumerations. On a high level, enum allows us to represent numbers as words for items that are grouped together. So we'll create a group or enum called action and assign a value to each of our 4 action items or options. Back to our code, let's build a new module. I'm going to call it declare public variables. We will create a public enum which can be accessed from any module. The declaration for enum is basically like a statement like with. So enum and end enum. And since it's public, we will write public. And let's give this enum a name. We will call it action. And let's add in our 4 option values. These will be our enum member names. And let's assign a numbering to it. So full run will carry the value 1, import file 2, export file 3, and send email is 4. That's it. But while we're in this module, let's create an enum type for the preview email options as well. Okay, let's check out how to use the action enum type in our parent macro. So we'll go back to our parent macro. Let's come to our first if statement where we use the option value, delete off the 1, type in our action enum name, which is just action. Let's press our dot and we get our list of options as IntelliSense. We will choose full run, which is 1. Similarly, for the import action, which is 2, we will choose the import file only option. And I'm going to go ahead and change these rest of the values as well. Okay, that's all done. This code is so much more readable. Now let's test it out from the console sheet. We need to link the form button to our macro. Let's do that. We'll assign it to the full macro run, which is the parent macro. Click OK. And let's play out the various options. Let's select import file and click run. Okay. Need to fix some issues. Remove the equal to sign. Solve the macro. Let's play it again. Select import option. Click run. And we get the message import data. Select send only, email report, export data. And when we select full run, we should get 3 messages: import, followed by export, followed by send email. Import, export, and email report. Fantastic. Everything seems to be working well. Next, let's build out the import step. In this section, we'll build out the first step where we import the data. As a recap, our objective is to copy the data from the file indicated in the console sheet and paste its contents into our data sheet. Let's have a look at our input file. It is in the input folder. And that's it. And we're going to copy it as is into our data sheet. And just to be clear, the focus of this videos is not on these 3 steps. We are only interested in the console sheet values and error handling. So we'll speed up through the next 3 sections. Okay. Let's create a module. New sub. This sub will take the full file path of the input file that we had determined in the parent macro, which is this file path here. Let's open the file. Grab the full data set, which is just the current region. Clear the data from our data sheet and copy and paste the data. And finally, let's close the file. That's it. Let's call this sub procedure from the parent macro. We don't need the message box anymore. Go back to our console sheet, click on import file option and click the run button. Come to our data worksheet and the data has been pasted over, so that works well. Moving on to the export section. This step is called export data, but we are actually first going to transform the data that we had copied previously and then export it. Let's go to the data sheet. The transformation is straightforward. We'll look up the product ID in column B within column A of the lookup worksheet and return back the product name into column F. Similarly, we'll grab the store name based on the store ID from the lookup worksheet. And column H will be the product of the price and the units in column D and E respectively. Let's code this out. Back to our code. Okay, first let's build a rather cool function. We will code a generic VLOOKUP function that we will be using 3 times within this project. So let's go to our supporting logic module, create a new function. And just FYI, I have a deep dive video on the find function where we create this custom lookup function. So if you want to learn more about doing these custom find functions, please check that video out. Back to our code. So this custom lookup value function will take the sheet as a parameter. This is where the lookup table is located. Then we need the column number of the value that we are looking up. You'll need the value that we're looking up and the offset column for the returned value. This is how many columns to the left or right we need to move to get our associated value. And since this is a generic function, let's return a variant. Okay, so we're going to do a lookup using the find function. The find function returns a range. Let's declare it. So let's build the logic. Where are we going to perform the find operation? We're going to perform the operation in the sheet that is passed as a parameter within the column number, which is our second parameter. It's called the find method. Let's move to a new row. What are we looking for? We're looking for the search value. We will match the full cell and we'll search in the forward direction. Why is this an error? I think I have made a typo. That's not it. Let's try and find the error. We are missing an equal to out here. That should do it. And if a match is found, or rather if the find range is not nothing, just gonna copy and paste. Don't want any more typos. So if a match is found, the function will return the value that is offset by the number that we've provided in the parameter. And if no match is found, we will return a blank value. Okay, that's it. Let's start the transformation logic. Let's create a new module. Let's create a new sub. This sub will take the output file path as a parameter. So we'll just take this. The first part, we will just clear the values out here. Let's find the last row of the data set. We're going to loop over the data, so we need an iteration variable. First, we'll look up the product name based on the product ID and place it in column F. So let's add a header to column F. And the value of the current cell in column F will be the output of the lookup function that we just created. Let's go to our supporting logic worksheet, copy the function name, come back to the transform data module. So first we need the worksheet name. We are going to look up in the lookup worksheet, which is WS lookup codename. We will look up in the first column. So we're going to look up in the first column and grab the value one column to the right. Next, what are we looking for? We're looking for the value in column B, and offset is 1. Similarly, let's go the logic for column G. Here, we are still looking up in the lookup worksheet. We're looking up in column D, which is number 4. We'll grab the data from column C, and we're going to still return the value that is one column to the right. And finally, let's get the total sales value. So that's column D times column E. Just love to copy and paste stuff. D times E. Okay, that's it for a loop. Now what we need to do is paste this data in a new file. Let's copy the current region and paste it into the new worksheet. We'll just auto fit the columns as well. Let's save this workbook. We'll save it as the output file name, and we're providing the full file path. And let's close the workbook. Let's call this sub pharma parent macro. So we're coming down to where we're just running the export option. Okay, let's test this out. Come to the console sheet, select export only option. But first, let's check the output folder. It's blank at the moment. Let's run the macro. And as expected, I'm obviously going to make some sort of an error. Let's debug this. So it said type mismatch, which means that I've probably not set one of these parameters correctly. Let's go to the lookup function. Sheet as worksheet, column as long, search value as, that's the mistake. Search value should be a string. We said okay. Let's save and run the macro again. That seems to have worked. Let's go to the data sheet. We can see our lookups have worked. There is a slight mistake out here which we need to correct. So we pasted the total sales in column I. We should be pasting in column H. That's easy enough to correct, but let's just check. Our output file has been created, but before we try and open it, let's correct our mistake and run this macro again. Go back to our code. Let's come to the transform data module. This should be column H. Okay. Let's delete the export file. Save the macro. Run the macro again. Go to data worksheet. This looks better. Go to the output sheet. Open the file. Right. All the data has been pasted over. Now let's move on to the next section where we send out the email. Now it's time to send out the file that we had created in the previous section as an attachment. Let's go to our code. Let's create a new module. Create a new sub. This sub will take in all the parameters that we had defined for the email option. And remember that the email IDs are stored in an array. Okay, first we need to put all these email IDs into a single string separated by a semicolon. We're going to create a function for this. So let's go to our supporting logic module. Make some space, create a function. We will pass in the array of email IDs as a parameter. And it will return back a string full of email IDs. We will need to iterate over the array. So let's define an iteration variable and a variable to hold the email IDs and a variable to hold the final string value. Let's create a for loop which starts from the lower bound of the array to the upper bound. First, let's read the email ID. And we'll create the full email string by adding a semicolon after the email ID, and we'll add the value of the email string from the previous iteration as well. So this will create a giant string of email IDs, and let's return it back to the function, and let's call this function from our send email function that we are coding right now. So first let's define a variable to hold the email string returned by the function. Let's pass in the array. Now we're ready to send the email. Let's create a connection to the Outlook application. And using this connection, we can create an email object. I am consciously speeding through this part. You can check out my deep dive videos on Outlook emails if you want. Okay, let's fill up the email properties. For the to option, we need to provide the full email string. PCC is blank. PCC is blank. Subject will be the subject parameter as is. We will grab the email body from the function parameters as well. And just a fair warning, we are going to return to this part in just a bit, so watch out for that. And let's add the attachment or the file that we had passed to the function as well. Okay, let's go back to the console sheet for a bit. Remember that we are providing the user the option to either preview the email before sending or send the email directly. We need to code this logic in, and we will use the preview email enumeration that we had declared earlier. Okay, back to our email function. The value of the preview option is being passed to the function. We will use the select case statement to code the correct option. So case 1 will actually be the yes option in the preview email enumeration. And for this option, we will simply display the email. And case 2 will be the no option. And in this case, we will send the email. And that's it. Let's save and call this function from the main macro. So we'll replace the message box with our function. Let's pass in all the parameters in the correct order. That's still red. I think I need to say call before this. Yep, that's right. Let's test it out now. Okay, let's select the email only option. Let's select preview and let's run the macro. Our email has been created. The user can now inspect the contents of the email, open the file, double check everything, and manually hit the send button once satisfied. So everything looks correct out here except the email body. All the text seems to be in one continuous line. This does not look appealing. So what is happening here? So let's return back to the console worksheet. Our email body looks correct in the cell I13 itself. That is, the text is on separate lines within the cell. And just a reminder on how to display the text in separate lines in a single Excel cell. Let's just type it out back in one single line. So that's actually a single line. It's showing on two lines because the sheet is still protected. Let's unprotect the sheet. Okay, so that's basically on a single line. Let's click into the cell, and wherever we want to move to a new line within the cell, let's click Alt Enter and another Alt Enter. This act of hitting Alt Enter is actually recorded in the back end of the cell as a new line character given by VBLF in VBA. We can actually see this in Notepad++. Let's just copy this text. Let's come to Notepad++, paste the text, go to View, go to Show Symbol, show all characters, and we can see that a carriage return, that is CR, and a line feed, which is LF, has been recorded. Now, I'm not going to go too much into detail out here, but for our email subject to display correctly, we need to replace the line feed or LF character with an HTML break tag. Let's do that. Okay, back to our email function. We will grab the body and use the replace function. The expression is the email body itself. What are we looking for? We are looking for the line feed character, which is given by VBLF. And what are we going to replace it with? We are going to replace it with the HTML break tag. Okay, let's save this. Come to our console sheet and hit the run button. Great, our text is now in separate lines, just as it is reflected in the Excel cell. This was actually a very handy trick. Okay, so the three parts of our macro are working individually. Let's try and do a full run. Fingers crossed, save the file, hit the run button. Our email has been generated. Let's close the email and let's do a full run where we directly send out the emails without previewing the actual email itself. And just to tell you all, these are actually bogus emails. So hopefully no one gets these emails when I send them out. Hit the run button. And we can come to Outlook, and in the sent folder, we can see our email had been sent out. Great. So everything is working, and that's it for the first part of this project. Everything is working correctly up until now, but we haven't added any error handling. If the user types in even one value incorrectly in our input cells, our macro is going to break horribly, giving one of those backend debug system messages. Let us break it on purpose to show you what I mean. Let's feed in an incorrect folder. Let's just import the file. The folder is obviously wrong. Hit the run button. And yeah, we don't want the user to see this. If you press debug, it goes into the code and well, someone is going to panic. So let's stop and exit and correct our folder path. Now, we are building this macro for a third person and we don't want them to see such messages. So we need to put in error handling that will have two objectives. Validate errors due to user input, and if something goes wrong in these errors, notify the user in a way that's not intimidating. But we can't possibly account for each and every error that will occur. So for every non-user input related error, we will notify back a custom message to contact the macro admin. And in both cases, we need to exit the macro elegantly. During the demo, we had seen the list of custom error codes and descriptions. Let's have a look at it again. We are explicitly going to check for some user input values, such as whether the file name is correct, whether the user has selected an action, whether the email ID looks correct, etc. And at the time of the check in our macro code, we will be manually assigning each of those failures a custom error code. And when a failure occurs, we will look for the associated description and place it in the error sheet. And before we move on, I want to point out why we are following this design. This is a scalable way to handle errors elegantly. If we want to add more custom error handling, we will add the error code and description here and route that custom error through the design that we are going to build shortly. Lot of big words, I know. So the best way to show you what I mean would be to delete all these errors and we'll add them in whenever we get to it. Okay, so now we will first build a wrapper procedure which will take in the error code and return back the error message in the error sheet. Now, we are going to build a sub that will look up the custom error code from the admin sheet and return back the description on the error sheet. And if it's not a custom error that we are tracking, we will display a default message to contact the admin. Let's create a new module, create a sub. It will take in the error code as an optional parameter. And we'll pass in a suffix parameter as a string that will be optional as well. That's suffix. We will use this suffix parameter to append any text value at the start of the error message. For example, our message may be that the file does not exist. Using suffix, we can pass in a text input so that the error message could say input file does not exist. This will help us to keep the procedure generic. We will grab the error description based on the error code using the lookup function that we had built in part 1 of this video, and we will store the description returned by the lookup function in a string variable. And we'll be performing a lookup only if we pass the error code. Remember, this is optional. Let's call the lookup function, which is this one from the supporting logic module that we had created. We will search in the admin sheet. We will search in column 1. We will search for the error code that we are passing through out here. And we will grab the description from one column to the right, so offset by 1. That's it. Let's add a header to the error sheet. If we are passing the error code, and if we are also passing the suffix, and if the error description that is returned is not blank, then we will append the suffix to the error description. So if suffix is not blank, error code is not blank, description is not blank, then let's add the suffix to the description. Now, the error code is only reserved for custom errors that we are tracking, so we will build separate functions very shortly that use those error codes. But there always exists the possibilities of an unknown error arising. If that happens, we will call this sub without any error code or suffix and pass in a default error description. I promise all of this is going to make sense once we actually start using this sub, so please bear with me for just a few minutes. So this is our default error message. And let's place this error description in our error worksheet. And let's be a bit tidy and auto fit the column. Okay, so this is our wrapper function. Let's call this from our parent sub. Go back to our parent macro. At the very top, we are going to put in an error handler that directs the macro to a line label if any error occurs anywhere within our macro. And let's also clear the error worksheet. And let's create this line label. Scroll all the way down to the bottom of our sub. Let's make some space. Till now, we had created this line label terminate sub. This will be reserved for directing user-related custom error handling, which we haven't yet built. Any errors outside these custom errors will go all the way down to the admin override label. And to separate these two labels, let's exit the sub after the terminate sub label. This means that any of this terminate sub logic will not accidentally override with the admin override logic. So we need to activate our alerts again. We will reset the error handler. In both places. Actually, do it just after. Let's call our record sub. Okay, so in the admin section, we will display the default message to contact the admin in the error worksheet. We need to check if there is any error and notify the user. This sub just places an error message in the error worksheet. Now we need to build another sub to check whether this sub has placed any error message in the error worksheet, and that will indicate to us that an error has occurred. So let's build that function. Go back to the error handling macro. So remember, if an error has occurred, this record error sub will place a value in range 1 of the error worksheet. So this sub is going to check whether range A1 in the error worksheet is not blank. Let's just copy this. So if the value is not blank, that means an error has occurred. Let's activate the error worksheet and display a message for the user. Okay, let's call this sub from our parent macro. And we're going to call it after the record error sub. And we need to call it after the terminate sub label as well. Okay, this may seem a bit overwhelming because we have just been coding and error handling is kind of abstract until you actually apply it. So let me explain the overall flow. When we start this parent sub, we will activate our admin override error handler, which means if any system error occurs, the macro will be directed to the admin override line label. It will record the default error message in the error worksheet and notify the user that an error has occurred and exit the sub. But we will shortly build few custom checks like check if the input file is missing. If that happens, we will direct the macro to the terminate sub line label, which will check for any errors that have been recorded by custom functions, notify the user that an error has occurred, and exit the sub. And the third scenario is when no error occurs. In that case, the code will naturally run through its course, hit the terminate sub line label. It will check for errors. There will be none. So it will move to the exit sub line. And that's it. Okay. Let's test this macro out. First, let's just run it as is without any errors. So that just imported the file. We didn't get any message. Great. Now let's change the input folder value. Remember the last time we did this, we got a system error message. Now let's press run. And we get a message saying that at least one error was found. Okay. And we're directed to the error page. Now that is elegant. Let's recap. So far, we have created an error handling process that directs the user to the error page when a system or runtime error occurs. And note that we just need one error handling setup in the topmost or parent macro. So even if an error occurs in a child sub, such as the import data or the transform data, or even within the child sub in that child sub, the code will still get directed to the admin override in the parent macro. This concept is called bubbling up of errors, and we'll deep dive into this when I do a separate video dedicated just to error handling. Okay, let's move on and build our custom checks. Now we are going to account for errors that may occur if the user inputs data incorrectly in this console worksheet. In this case, we will raise a custom error message in the error sheet and elegantly exit the sub procedure via the terminate sub line label. All the data in peach color here is where the user needs to input information that will be read by the macro. So each of these cells represents a point of failure for a macro. If we don't do anything, the user will just get a message saying contact the admin. But the whole point of this project is to give the user control of this macro workbook so that they may run different scenarios and troubleshoot by themselves whenever possible. So with that objective, we will add code that tells the user what the issue is so that they may rectify and run the macro again without having to contact us. Let's revisit this record error macro that we had built earlier. Till now, we have just used this default message without passing any of our parameters. Let's start with a simple use case. The user needs to select an action option, but if no option is selected, or in other words, if cell E2 is blank, then we need to warn the user. So first, we'll come to our admin worksheet and add in an error code and a custom description. Let's go to the parent macro and let's call the record error macro in place of this message box. And we'll pass in this error code as the parameter. Okay, let's come to the console worksheet. Cell E2 is blank. Let's run the macro. We are redirected to the error message. Click OK, and we get the correct error description. Great. Next, let's validate the folder and file path. Each of our three subprocesses, that is import, export, and send email, interact with a file. The import process interacts with the input folder path and file name, and the export and send email interact with the output folder and file name. But we will build a generic function to validate all three cases. Let's come to our supporting logic module. All the way down, let's build a function. This function will take in the folder path, file name, and flow name. The flow name would be input or output. And this function will return back the full file path, which is a string. First, we'll check whether this folder path has a backslash at the end, and if there isn't, we will add one. Next, we'll check whether this folder exists. We will do this in a separate generic function. This function will take in the folder path and the flow as a parameter, and it will return a boolean that is a true or false. We will use the dir or directory function to check if the folder exists. If we're checking for a folder, we need to explicitly say directory. So if this folder path doesn't exist, then this directory function will return a blank. So if it's blank, we'll record an error, but let's first add the error code. Come to the admin worksheet, add an error code and a description. Go back to the macro. So we'll call the record error sub, passing in the code as a parameter, and we'll pass in the flow as well, which will get appended to the description. If the folder doesn't exist, we'll record an error and this function will return a false. And if it does exist, we'll return a true. And let's call this function from our previous function. So we need to pass in the folder path, flow. If it's false, This means that the folder in the console sheet is invalid and we need to exit the full macro. So we will first go to a line label and exit the function by returning a blank folder path. Let's add the line label. So if the folder doesn't exist, this function will return a blank string. So we've checked whether the folder exists. Now we need to check whether the file name is correct. We're not checking whether this file actually exists. We will do that later. We just want to validate the file name itself. So let's do that in a separate function. This function will take the file name and flow, and it will return a boolean. We'll be evaluating multiple conditions. So let's add our terminate function line label beforehand. Let's come down a bit. So what this means is that if everything in our new function evaluates correctly, then we will return a true and exit the function. Else we'll return a false and end the function. We basically want the user to provide a file extension, which is .xlsx. So we will evaluate two conditions here. First, if the length of the file is less than or equal to 5, which is the length of the characters in .xlsx, then the file name provided obviously doesn't have an extension. Let's add an error code for this. Back to the function. First, check if the length of the file name is less than or equal to 0. Sorry, less than or equal to 5. If it is, we will call in the new error code and we will go to the line label. And if the length is greater than 5, and if the right 5 characters are not .xlsx, then we will record an error. And that's it. Let's call this function from the validate file path function that we were creating. And we'll basically do the same thing as above. So if the function returns a false, we will go to the terminate function line label. Okay, so far we've checked the folder path and we've checked the file name. And if both checks have passed, then we'll return the full file path, that is the folder path concatenated with the file name. So the folder path concatenated to the file name, and we'll return the file path back to the function. So our validate file path function is ready. Let's call it from the parent sub. Go back to the parent macro. We need to call this function from two places. First, we will call it before we run the import procedure. So I had already put in a reference because I knew I was going to do this. Let's remove that comment. So the full file path now will get populated via the file function. We are passing in the folder path, the file name, and the flow, which is input. And if the returned full file path is blank, then we will go to the terminate sub line label. I'll again say this, if this seems confusing, I will admit that explaining error handling over a video is tough because we are dealing with abstractions. I hope you'll understand better once we test it out. Okay, so we need to do this one more time. Just gonna copy this full thing as is and we need to come down to the second comment that I'd made, and we'll populate the output file path using the function again. So let's remove this, paste in the input file path logic, do a control F, and do a replace. Replace all. Okay. Our functions now are ready to test. Let's go to the console worksheet. Let's click on import file, and the input folder is wrong. So let's run the macro. We are prompted that an error has occurred, and it tells us that the input folder was not found. And remember, in the previous module when we did this, we were directed to the default contact admin message, which confirms that a custom error handler is kicking in now. Go back to the console worksheet. Let's type in an incorrect output folder, go to the export file option, hit run, click OK, and it tells us the output folder was not found. And that's the beauty of creating generic functions, so that we're using the same function to call both the input and the output validator. We have one more test to run. Let's change the extension and run the macro. Okay. And it tells us the output file name needs a .xlsx extension. And let's do that as well. Same error. Okay. Now, so far we have the full file path, but we haven't checked whether these files actually exist or not. And remember that all the three processes will need to check this, but each with different logic. The import process requires the input file to be present. The export process requires no file to be present in the output folder because it is going to create one. And the sent email requires a file to be present in the output folder because it needs to attach it. And we'll again write only one generic function to test all three scenarios. So going back to our supporting logic macro, let's create a function that will take in the full file name and flow name and return a boolean. If the file exists, we'll return a true and a false otherwise. We can use the dir function to check if the file exists. But the file existing means different for different subprocesses. Let's add our error messages first. Come to the admin worksheet. So if the flow is output or rather export, then the file shouldn't exist in the folder. Let's record the error accordingly. We'll say that the file exists and return a true, and else means that the file doesn't exist. So if the flow is not output, then we need to record an error saying that the file is missing. Again, all of this will make more sense once we test it out. And the function will return a false. Okay, let's call this function from the parent sub. First, let's call it before we run the import process. So if the file doesn't exist, we will terminate the sub because there is no input file to import from. We need to pass in the full file path, our flow, and if the function returns a false, then we'll go to the terminate sub line label. Oh, I've got a typo. Delete that off. Let's copy. Next, we need to call it before the transform or export process, which is right here. So what we're trying to do out here is that if the file exists, means if the function returns a true, then we cannot really export out the file because a file with the same name already exists and we need to terminate the sub. And for our third call, we will call the function before we actually send out the email. Let's copy this. So before sending out the email, we need to make sure that the output file already exists. So this is the email flow, because if the file does not exist, then we don't have any file to send as an attachment. Okay, let's save this and we'll test out each of the 3 steps one by one. First, what we'll do is come to our folder, go to the input file, and I'm just going to move out the file, which means we don't have any import file. Click here, run the macro. At least one error was found and it tells us that the input file wasn't found. Great. Let's paste it back. We're going to test out the output process. Let's go to the output folder. So a file already exists, which means that we cannot actually run the export process, but let's test it out via the macro. Click the export option, click run. One error was found because the output file already exists. That is correct. Come back, and now we are going to delete the file. And lastly, we are going to try and send the email. But this should throw an error because there is no file to attach. Let's run the macro. Okay. And it tells us that the email file was not found. So all our logic seems to be working correctly. All that's left now is to validate the input details related to our email. And for the final part, let's build some checks to see whether all the details related to sending out the email are correct. And we are going to do an interesting function to check whether the email IDs are correct. Let's go to the supporting logic macro. Make some space. Okay, let's create a function. This function will take the preview option value, which is the value from cell E8, which indicates whether the preview email option is chosen or not. We'll take the email subject, which is a string, and it will take the email IDs, which are stored inside an array. Need a comma. And note, we are not actually evaluating the email body because the user can choose to send no text in the email ID, and that's valid. Let's add the terminate function logic. Let's just copy it from somewhere up here. So the logic is that if you're validating multiple conditions in a function, then I choose to follow this pattern of exiting the function via line label. Okay, let's add in our error codes. Back to our code. First, we'll check whether the preview cell is blank or not. Then we'll record an error. And go to the terminate function line label. Next, we'll check whether the email subject is blank or not. And if it is, we'll record an error and terminate the function. And just as a recap, we had loaded the email IDs into a dynamic array. So now we need to check whether the user has entered at least one email ID. We can actually do that right here in the parent sub. So if this last row is 2, then we will record an error and terminate a sub. And last row equals to 2 means that if there are no email IDs, our last row will be determined as this header row out here, which is row 2. Okay, back to the validate email function. Now, the last thing left to do is to check whether each email ID is valid. So we will iterate over the array of email IDs and grab each email ID. Let's grab the email ID and let's write the evaluation code in a separate function which will return a false if the email ID is not valid. Let's make a function. Okay, let's think what we're going to do. There are numerous ways to evaluate the email ID. The best way is to use a regular expression or regex, but I won't get into that today. I will use a simple logic. The email ID needs to have at least one symbol in it. It can't be more and it can't be less. Let's add an error code for that error. Back to our code. The email identifier is the symbol. We're now going to loop over this email ID. We need to have a count and found variable. Let's set the count variable to 0. This count variable is going to store the number of occurrences of the symbol in the string. And we will check this using the insta function. So we're going to start looking from the first character of the string, which is the email ID. And we are looking for the symbol, which is the email identifier. This function returns the position of the first occurrence of a substring in the main string. And if we find one occurrence, let's search for more occurrences. Because remember, the email ID can have only one symbol. So we'll search for multiple occurrences using a do-while loop. Let's record the number of found occurrences in the count variable. And let's do an other search. But this time, our starting position will be 1 after the last position where we found the email identifier. I think I need some more space here. Okay, let's come out of the loop. So by now we have populated this count variable and all we have to do is check whether the count is 0 or the count is greater than 1. And if it is, then we'll record an error. Let's pass in an error code. And now let's call this function from our previous email parameter function. So if the email ID is incorrect, then we will terminate the function. And that's it. Only one thing left to do. Let's call this function from our parent macro right before we want to send the email out. Okay, I'll probably just scroll down. Okay, if let's fill in all our parameters. So if this function returns a false, then we will terminate the sub. Let's save and test it out. Go to the console worksheet. So first, let's blank out the preview option, keep send email selected, and let's run the macro. We get an error message, and that's not the correct error message. Okay, couple of things. I think I've accidentally renamed the admin sheet. That's fine. We are coding based on our worksheet code name, so that kind of does not matter. But the error was email file not found. I think in the last section we had actually deleted the file. So what we will do first is we will just do a full run. So it will import the file, create the file, and then we'll have a file to send as an attachment. So let's do that. One error found. So this time it should be please select a preview option. All right, that's good. Let's select a preview option. Let's test out a few other errors. Let's remove the subject, run, output file. Sorry, I'm getting at the end of a very long video. My brain's not completely working. We should not do a full run because we need to delete out the export file first. So we will just do the send email option. Click run. Okay. So it tells us the subject is missing, which is correct. And next, let's delete out these emails and run the macro. Okay. It tells us to enter at least one email, which is correct. And for the last bit, let's remove one @ symbol from one of the emails, hit the run button, and it tells us one email ID is correct. And just to be a bit smart, let's add two @ symbols, hit the run button. It still tells us that the email ID is incorrect, which is correct. Okay. And just to test that we haven't actually broken anything, let's delete the output file and do one end-to-end run with the preview option on. Okay, click run. And our email has successfully generated. So everything is working. Oh, that was a long project. And if you're still watching the video, congratulations on getting this far. Okay, that's the full project.